Listen-only mode.
Afternoon, everyone, as the case may be, and welcome to our webinar in the series, the 2011 series from the National Wraparound Initiative. Our webinar today is going to focus on engaging and involving youth in wraparound. We're going to have two presentations as part of this webinar. First, we're going to hear about the Youth Empowerment Support Program and the different ways that staff there work to provide direct support, learning, and leadership opportunities for the young people who are involved in their system of care, and with a special focus on how that integrates with wraparound process. In the second presentation, we'll be talking about the Achieve My Plan project, which is an empirically supported process for when a young person works with a coach, an AMP coach, who supports that young person's participation in the wraparound process. So we're going to begin, as I mentioned, with the information about the Youth Empowerment Support Program, and the presenter is going to be Tammy Cherry, who is the program manager for that program. As a child, Tammy received 10 years of child welfare services and also received related mental health and informal probation services throughout that time. She emancipated out of the child welfare system at 18. At 19, she started working for a group home that served youth who were on probation and who struggled with substance abuse. She then took a job as a youth coordinator in the Placer County. She has been the program manager for the Youth Empowerment Support Program for several years now. So Tammy, take it away. Tammy? I think you might still be muted, okay?
Oh, our phone kept cutting out. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So I don't know what that was, but it kept cutting out. So it should be fine now, I think.
Okay, you're on.
Okay, so our program is the Youth Empowerment Support Program. It started in August 2007. Originally, it started because Placer County Children's System of Care received a 6-year federal grant through SAMHSA. The focus populations of the grant were Native American, Latino, and transition-age youth populations. Our program's focus was on transition-age youth. We started out providing direct support similar to the family advocate and parent partner role. Our program was actually housed underneath the family advocate program. Through the years, from feedback from our youth and county partners, our program has evolved. We now have identified and defined 4 components of our program. These components are direct support, groups, leadership opportunities, and trainings. Some of these components are well developed, for example, the direct support component, and others we are still working on developing. Our program is voluntary and individually tailored to meet the goal of each person referred. We'll talk a little bit more about how we do this for the direct support component of the program later on in this presentation. And actually keep that slide.
Okay, excuse me, Tammy, I didn't neglect to mention this, and I've already had a couple questions about this. All of the slides and the whole webinar, if people want to listen to it, will be posted on the National Wraparound Initiative website within a few hours or by tomorrow at the latest. And additionally, if we talk about posting other materials, you'll be able to reach it through the NWI. We will send, at the conclusion of the webinar, an email to all attendees, so you will have this information. Thanks. Sorry, Tammy.
Hello?
We can hear you. Uh-oh.
Hello?
Yeah? Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. It cut out again.
Oh. Maybe it cuts out when I'm talking, which would be a shame.
Yes.
Okay. Well, go ahead.
Okay. So the mission of our program is to provide a supportive and engaging program that helps young people among all races, beliefs, and cultures develop tools to achieve their goals. We also work to promote effective system transformation with active participation of young people in our community. And we do this through direct support, groups, trainings, and leadership opportunities. Next slide. So the first component of our program is direct support. In this component, we have hired youth coordinators who have lived experience that provides support and education to young adults through their personal experience and professional training. Last year, about 43% of our direct support referrals were made by the Wraparound program in our county. Some other referring sources that we have are placement decision-making boards, child welfare services, probation, and even individuals in the community. And like I stated earlier, this role is very similar to the family advocate role, only we are working with the youth and young adult in the family instead of the caregiver. Although we're working with the youth, we make sure to have strong communication with all of the individuals involved with the person referred. Next slide. Listed here are some examples of ways that we can support youth, but because our services are individually tailored, our support looks different depending on the individual. We make sure not to duplicate services, but instead fill in the gaps. Some of the things that we have done in the past through our direct services are provide independent living services when youth we're working with don't qualify for our local independent living programs, go over case plans, IEPs, court records, and probation terms and conditions with youth and young adults, and explain how they can have input in the process if it applies, teach youth their rights and how to advocate appropriately for them if needed, help youth understand and identify ways to have authentic participation in Wraparound. Some examples of how we've done this in the past are we've come up with creating meeting agreements, having the youth facilitate the meeting, or meeting with them before the meeting to identify ways that they can talk about or identify the things that they would like to talk about in the meetings. We meet and support youth in the hospital, the juvenile detention facilities, emergency shelters, or after crisis. We provide a safe place to vent about challenges with placement and brainstorm ways to make it work. We help to identify and connect with family members or friends, or help youth identify team members for family team meetings. We also work with the facilitator and team members to help the youth achieve their goals and understand the youth perspective, as well as much more. Direct support can start after the WRAP team has already started. When Wraparound goes away, we don't have to end, and many times youth are referred right before WRAP ends to help with the transition from Wraparound. Next slide. In our second component, we provide youth-guided groups. Many times these groups are focused on advocating for particular community challenges. To give you some examples of what groups can look like, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the groups we've provided. In the past, we had a group called the Youth Advisory Group. This group actually brainstormed challenges in the community and identified goals to work on. The goal that they decided to work on was that there wasn't enough affordable things to do in our community, and that transition-age youth didn't have a place to go to get resources. Although this group has gone through a transition, our program is still working with a small group on creating a free Battle of the Bands event with resource booths incorporated. We also had 3 groups where we hired 12 former foster youth to pick an issue and create advocacy videos about it. The focus of the 3 groups were that were around youth rights and placement, improving probation and foster youth educational outcomes, and increasing affordable things for youth to do in the communities. These groups created 3 advocacy videos and designed a youth rights packet for youth in placement. This packet applies to all youth in California that are in child welfare, probation, or mental health systems, and that reside in foster homes, group homes, mental health facilities, boot camps, and juvenile detention facilities. This group evolved into a group called Change, which stands for Change Happens Around New Generations Experiences. This group developed strategies to improve the issues mentioned above. Some of the examples of strategies they came up with were to create a sponsor program for youth to participate in extracurricular activities to help fund them to participate in those, to recruit more foster homes for teens around different school districts, and to distribute the created rights packet to all youth placed in Placer County. We also have a group called Stigma Busters. This group is a group where they get together and support each other in developing and telling their story to reduce stigma, and they later take those stories to provide trainings throughout to a variety of different audiences. The one thing you want to consider when you decide, if you decide to try and engage young people in groups, is that there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work and time that goes into it, so you want to make sure to have the capacity to do it. Next slide. There are many times when a youth or young adult is required or even desired in various leadership opportunities. Some examples of possible leadership opportunities are boards, committees, decision-making meetings, etc. This component, this is why we created a leadership opportunity component of our program. This component is a great way to create sustainable system change by utilizing lived experience and professional knowledge to come up with realistic solutions that meet everyone's needs. Currently, most of the leadership opportunities right now are covered by our youth coordinators. We will continue to be looking at ways to involve young adults in the community in these leadership opportunities in the future. Because we want them to be active members and not just have a token role, we want to make sure to do the following when we do involve them. So one of the things that you would want to try and do is go to the leadership opportunities first and talk about ways to make it more inviting to young people. Try and set things in place so that when the young person does become a part of the meeting, there's an opportunity to talk about what safety looks like to them and to build relationships with all of the members. When you invite the young person to come, make sure that they have the support needed to attend. For example, transportation is a huge challenge in our community, so making sure that they have resources to provide transportation, and understand the purpose of the leadership opportunity they're being asked to come to. We usually would want to sit in the meeting with the young person, but to take a back seat. They're really there providing the voice, but we're there to support and answer any questions they may have, and then slowly back out of the meeting as they become more comfortable. We would want to follow up every once in a while to see if they need any additional support after we've left the meeting. And when we ask young people to come to leadership opportunities, we would want to make sure that it matches up with that young person's interests and experiences. We feel that these steps will help the young people being asked to come to be consistent, active members of the leadership opportunities they are involved in. Next slide. So trainings is the last component of our program. When groups we have worked with in the past are working on projects around system or community change, one of the ways that we have brought awareness to their project is by providing trainings. Through feedback we're given from all of our youth and young adults, we're also able to identify common trends that work or best practices. So instead of working in a bubble, we try to bring these to others' attention through trainings. Some of the trainings that we have provided with feedback or participation of our youth are trainings showcasing our rights packet and advocacy videos done by the summer interns. Some of our staff are currently trained in the Youth Development Institute training through the Youth Development Network and are working on providing trainings throughout Placer County's systems of care. We have already provided one of these trainings to community partners in Placer. We have also provided interactive trainings that showcase personal stories to decrease stigma, which the trainings were produced by the group The Stigma Busters. Youth and young adults in our program have also identified wanting to provide awareness trainings for foster parents, And they have also wanted to provide trainings promoting informing youth in placement about their rights. Next slide. Now that I've explained the structure of our program, I would like to talk a little bit about how it can benefit systems to hire staff with lived experience. Although there are many reasons, some of the benefits of hiring staff with lived experience are that it will cause a change in perspective where systems and staff see the community as a resource and not just a recipient. It gives us the opportunity to engage youth and families through peer understanding, which in turn makes services more effective. It helps us create more sustainable solutions to improve our outcomes by utilizing the community's perspective as well as the systems, and it reduces stigma and increases understanding for both staff and families. All of these are really great examples of how hiring individuals with lived experience can increase better outcomes for families in the community and also utilize system resources more effectively. Next slide. There are some things you'll want to consider before hiring staff with lived experience. To respect the staff that you're hiring, you may want to make sure to have a process in place to mark their case with the system as sensitive. This will help them to be seen in more of a professional light and respect that although they're being hired for their lived experience, their life is not all of a sudden an open book. This will also make sure that if for some reason something needs to be done with their case while they're employed, that it is handled appropriately. It is important that staff hired have an avenue to build relationships with system staff outside of their daily work. This will help the collaboration happen more smoothly and increase awareness of everyone's perspective and culture. Some examples of ways you can do this, here at Placer we actually have an integrated workspace where we work with all of the staff like social workers, probation officers, wraparound facilitators. Also, you could look at having combined staff retreats where they have an opportunity to really get to know each other. You can also create equal roles on boards or committees where staff can sit together, or you can have trainings that you schedule together. Another good thing to have in place is the capacity to provide consistent supervision and support. It's really important for people in this role to have that avenue. Staff come to the table with lived experience, and because of this, it kind of creates an extra challenge to doing the job. Making sure that you have the capacity to provide consistent supervision will help create a supportive environment to work through some of the things that may come up. It will also serve as a great opportunity to provide training and review cases. When you're looking for new staff, the first thing that we do is we usually ask young people in the community where to recruit. Keep in mind that every community is different and has different hangout spots. Asking young people in your community is a good way to find out where to start. Some of the places that our youth have brainstormed have been like laundromats, bus stops, local colleges, and most of all, tell the youth that you or your partners work with. Many times the best strategy to getting the word out to young people is through word of mouth. You can also utilize young people in the community to come up with some really good interview questions. When you're creating an interview question or your interview questions, you may want to consider using scenarios. One of the scenarios that we've used in the past have been if you were driving with a youth to an appointment that gets canceled and the youth asked you to drop them off at a fast food place in town with some friends, what do you do? This helps you to see the type of boundaries that the individual interviewing possesses, which is a very important piece to doing this job. You may also want to provide an avenue for staff hired to have say in program development. It is valuable to have a point person who is in a leadership role with the system that you're partnering with to talk to when there are barriers to the work that you're doing. If you have a person identified and you meet with them on a regular basis, it will really help with the process of working through some of the barriers that may arise. Next slide. So there are many valuable roles someone with lived experience can provide. It is important that you match their experience and their expertise to their role, though. For example, some of the things that people with lived experience can be very valuable at doing are running groups, doing direct services, speaking up in leadership meetings. If you don't have the flexibility due to maybe funding requirements, then get creative in your interview process. Ask questions that will assess their ability in the area that you're really looking to hire for. It helps to have trainings identified before hire and then to continue to work with your staff to assess their training needs after hire. Because you're hiring staff based on their personal experience and not necessarily their educational experience, ongoing training is important. Some trainings that we make sure to provide are trainings on strengths-based approach, trainings on HIPAA, trainings on the youth development and the 41 developmental assets, mandated reporting trainings, cultural competency trainings, which are really important to actually have ongoing after the staff is hired as well, and then de-escalation trainings, conflict resolution trainings, storytelling, so trainings to really help individuals with telling their stories. We try to give a clear overview of the system or program or organization that they're being hired with, as well as the organizations they're partnering with. So giving an overview of child welfare, probation, the wraparound process, mental health systems, IEP meetings, team decision-making meetings. We also try to train them on youth rights and placement. We try and take time to clearly review all policies and procedures and answer any questions they may have. Provide trainings on confidentiality. They go through a 5150 certification and recertification training. We try and provide trainings on self-care and boundaries. We usually plan site visits to tour after staff are hired. For example, sometimes we go to schools, resource centers, partner offices. This helps them to get more familiar with the places as well as more likely to utilize the resources available. We also take time to introduce them to all the staff so that they feel more comfortable and have more of an understanding of what people do. We talk about the importance of we did talk about the importance of consistent supervision earlier. Remember that it's valuable to have ongoing supervision, not just at the beginning of hire. Take time to review the job description like we talked about earlier, and ask for changes early and make them. Go over all the forms and expected reporting requirements. Go over policies and procedures like dress code and confidentiality. Next slide. So now I'm going to take some time to talk more about our direct support role. This is actually the component of our program where we work most with the wraparound teams. The other three components are open to youth in the wraparound program, but they don't usually work directly with their teams as much. We developed 3 phases of the program. The first, or of the direct support component, the first phase is introduction and engagement phase. The second is the periodic/intensive phase. And then towards the end of our support is the transition phase. Next slide. When we first get a referral, our first goal is to get to know the person being referred and make sure they feel comfortable and safe meeting with us before we start in on goals with them. This is the introduction and engagement phase. Our first step is to set up a meeting with them and explain what our support can look like and introduce ourselves. We ask them where they are comfortable meeting and let them know that they are welcome to invite whomever they want to come to the meeting. We also take time to give a brief overview of our personal experience. For example, we may say something like, I grew up in the child welfare system and lived in foster homes as well. We find out if they're interested in a youth coordinator. If they aren't, we give them our contact information and we let them know that they can contact us anytime if they do need our support in the future. If They are interested. We work together to identify what our role looks like. For example, our role could be meeting by phone and doing check-ins. It could be going to court with them. It could be participating in wraparound meetings. Many times this is decided with the WRAP team or with their guardians. If it isn't decided with their team members or their support systems, our next step is to take it back to them and discuss it to make sure that everybody's on the same page. We also define our boundaries with the family at this time by explaining that we are mandated reporters, what our confidentiality policy is, and by getting any forms signed, for example, parental consent or releases of information. Most of the time, the youth, family, and teams start to identify some of the goals at this time, and we record them on a sheet that we call our goal sheet. The next few meetings, although we may be working on goals that they have identified, we're working on getting to know the individual better. So, with some youth and young adults, you may have to do this before they'll even be comfortable identifying goals. This may be going to a park, it may be walking, it may be going to get coffee, it may be just doing something that they like to do. It also just may be asking questions and talking about interests while we're working on goals with them. Next slide. We start the periodic/intensive phase after our role has been identified and we have started to work on goals with the individual. This phase looks very different depending on the individual. Sometimes it is us going with them to accomplish their goals. Sometimes it is us giving them information and they do it on their own, and sometimes it is them watching us do it and then they try it themselves the next time. Although we are all about meeting the youth where they're at, we also encourage them to do it on their own throughout the process so that they can learn from the process and gain the skills that they need to do it the next time. During this phase, we identify if they will need periodic support, which, for example, could be one-time-a-month meetings or maybe checking in by phone, or intensive support where we would be meeting one time a week or every other week. This helps to manage the caseload and not overwhelm the coordinators. A full-time youth coordinator usually carries a caseload between 7 to 15 families. It varies depending on how many families need intensive support or periodic support and what other duties are assigned to the youth coordinator. Sometimes families fluctuate between periodic and intensive as well, depending on life circumstances. During this phase, our main focus is working on the goals identified and identifying more goals throughout the process. Although this is the focus, mentoring and peer support are a result as well. We use a goal sheet to track all the goals that we're working on with each young person and to brainstorm new goals. Also keep in mind, goals don't always have to be traditional goals like get enrolled in school. Sometimes the goals identified are things like support the youth while he or she is adjusting to their placement, or support the youth while they're reading their court records. We still come up with action items to do these things with the youth and reassess them periodically to know if there is still a need and that we're accomplishing the goal identified. With each youth or young adult referred, we talk to them about who their team members are. For example, guardians, their WRAP team, their CASA workers. Throughout the process, we check in with team members to make sure that we are on the same page. Many times this is done with the youth so that it's not seen as going behind their back, or we talk to them about it prior. In this phase, we still take time to celebrate accomplishments or use rewards to motivate them if they're struggling with accomplishing their goals identified. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. So the transition phase starts if they're moving out of county, they have the tools needed to accomplish their goals at this point, or have other supports in place to accomplish their goals. We work hard not to duplicate services, so many times our role is to help them find the resources that will help them accomplish their goals. When there's not another resource that can help them, many times we're the ones that are there to fill in the gaps. When they start the transition phase, we help them to identify resources to accomplish their goals if that's still needed. We try to have a final celebration recognizing all their accomplishments while they've been meeting with us and try to say goodbye. And although we close after this point, we let them know that we are available in the future if needed, or if they move back in the county, we can meet more regularly. On average, we usually support a family for 6 months or less. Next slide. Some of the tools that you can use for data collection are your referral form. We actually have a goal sheet that I mentioned earlier where we track all of the goals that we work on with youth. It also states all of the action items that we've taken and when they were accomplished. There's also a portion of the goal sheet that has categories. Some of the categories are like child welfare, probation, family supports, legal help. And these are just categories to kind of help us know things that can help us brainstorm certain goals. And our goal sheet, we circle all of the areas that we do talk about with the youth so that we can kind of track the things that are discussed with the youth. We also have an asset survey. And this survey is something that tracks how many assets a youth has. It's based off of the 41 developmental assets by the Search Institute. And it really works best, this particular survey works best with youth under 18. It will help you to see if assets are decreasing or increasing during the time that you're supporting them. Another good tool could be an ending survey. Next slide. Here are some things some data you can get from your referral form. And I'll just mention a few. Some are like you can track the type of placement that they're in, the level of anticipated involvement, or even the ages that you're serving or ethnicity. Next slide. The goal sheet I talked a little bit about earlier, and this is actually something that we've just started. We have the tool developed, but we've just started collecting the data. And some of the things that we've noticed that we could get from this data source is trends and goals identified so that we can see where the gaps are in the system, and really giving that feedback to the system of, let's say we're getting a lot of youth who've been placed in guardianship that can't get ILP services, independent living services. We can kind of track things like that. It also helps us to track how many goals are getting completed with each youth that we're supporting. And it also helps us to see how the goals that are identified relate to the system that the youth is placed in. For example, if we get a lot of goals that are identified where youth want to have voice in their placement decisions and they are in the child welfare system, we can track that. Or if they're on probation and we get a lot of goals that say they want to understand their terms and conditions, we can really track that now. And it also helps us to identify the most common topics that are being discussed with each person. So are most of the youth that we work with talking about family supports, or are they talking about probation issues? So we're really excited to get started on really collecting this data, and we feel it's going to be really relevant to the work that we do. Next slide. The ending survey is also a tool that we haven't developed yet that we're looking at working on developing that could be really valuable in the work that we do. And some of the things that we could get from this type of tool are identifying things that have changed since the person being referred started. For example, has their placement changed? Have they started receiving more services or less services? It'll also help us track the length of support, so how long are we supporting each youth referred, and then also how many are closing each month. Next slide. So I just want to take some time to talk about funding suggestions if you're looking at at starting a program similar to ours, or you have a program similar to ours, many times you want to look at funding that allows for changes. For example, if the population that you're surveying changes or the ages. It's also nice to have a pot of money that you can call your flex funds. These funds are really needed. For example, if a youth needs to get an ID card to start work and there's no other funding source to help provide this, or if they need help with things like driver's training. You also may want to consider having funding to provide benefits for your staff or to reimburse them for their cell phone or mileage to avoid any staff transition. This will really encourage people to stay around. And then having funds for things like stipends or transportation resources is also really important because, like, for our community, transportation is an issue. So having funding set aside to help with bus passes or gas cards or things like that is really important. And then stipends, so like if you're deciding to run groups or leadership opportunities, really compensating youth for their time because they're doing that out of their own time. And then find funding that fits your program. Don't make the program fit the funding. That'll really ensure that you're accomplishing what your vision is and not warping your program to really meet the funding needs. So that's it for us, and I know there's going to be time for questions, but here's our contact information. You can contact me, Tammy Cherry, the program manager. We're also welcome to contact Christina Nicholson, who is the director of Whole Person Learning, if you have any questions after this presentation. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Tammy. So I did just want to ask a couple questions, real quick ones here, if you can respond. So a couple people asked about whether the resources that you mentioned will be, if we can share those. Are you willing to share the referral form, the goal sheet, the survey with us, and can we post those on the website?
Absolutely. I actually was going to put them into the slides and I couldn't figure it out. So we definitely could send the goal sheet and the referral form, and the asset survey is something that was developed by somebody else, so we could send you the resource that we have.
Very good. Okay, so everyone, that information will be coming to you in the email that you get as a follow-up, and it'll all be posted on the NWI website. So let's see if we can get one or two of these other real quick questions. Where does the funding for your program come from, and are all of the youth involved? I'm assuming this means the youth coordinators. Are they all paid?
So all of our youth coordinators are paid. We currently have funding through SB 163, and then we also have funding through Mental Health Services Act, Community Supports and Services dollars.
Okay, and those are California-specific funds?
I believe so. I know that MHSA one is, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. And then we had a question about whether the young people who are the youth coordinators have to be currently or previously, or both, I guess, involved with services. I think there was a little confusion about that.
So the youth coordinators that we have hired now previously received probation, child welfare, mental health, or special education services. But depending on the system that they receive, some, like for example, they can't be currently receiving child welfare services and then work in this role. But that would not apply to mental health services, of course. So it depends on the type of services that they receive. But all of our youth coordinators have experience with one of those systems.
Okay, thanks. I also have a note here that was posted by someone else that says that yes, indeed, both of the sources that Tammy mentioned earlier are California-specific funding.
Thank you.
And we are going to move ahead. into the next part of the program, and we'll be answering some more questions at the end, depending on the amount of time that we have. Yes.
I think we mentioned it earlier, but also another funding source that, or a few other funding sources that we've utilized in the past that are not, well, in some current, are SAMHSA dollars, and then also the Workforce Investment Board, Workforce Investment Board dollars as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're going to move along into the second part of the program. As I mentioned before, my name is Janet Walker, and I am a co-director of the National Wraparound Initiative, but I'm going to talk to you today about some work that I've done in another role that I have, which is co-director of a research and training center. It's called the RTC on Pathways to Positive Futures, which is focused on improving outcomes for young people transitioning to adulthood. So our population that we focus on at this point is from about 14 to 30. And these are transitioning young people who also have serious mental health conditions. So the work that's involved with Achieve My Plan was conducted, or is being conducted, through that Research and Training Center and also a previous Research and Training Center called the Research and Training Center on Family Support and Children's Mental Health. Next slide. Oh, we have a poll here. So real quick, if you guys want to take a minute to answer this one, what is the biggest benefit that you think of fostering youth participation in wraparound planning? And it's sort of their active engagement and involvement in their own planning. And I'm going to just keep talking while you guys can answer that one. So are people voting? Is that working, Sarah?
Yep, we have 20 or 35% voted right now.
Okay. So when we set out to do this AMP project, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the whole project in a minute, but one of the first things we wanted to know from our young people is what they thought about their experiences with youth participation. And what emerged after a while of working with our advisors about this is a video that is focused on why youth participation is important. And it sort of answers this question from their perspective. Our advisors are all very extremely systems experienced, and they're talking about what it's like. Primarily their experiences are experiences related to not being very involved in their team planning, but not exclusively that. And they talk about what it's like and what it feels like not to be involved, and really what it feels like to have people ask you for your ideas and then to have those ideas be ignored later on. And a frequently described experience of young people that they're being asked over and over again to provide their input, and then when they finally do provide their input, it's ignored, and so their level of trust goes down and their eagerness to engage also goes down. So can we show the results of the poll? So here we have, I mean, of course, all of these are very good reasons to involve young people in the wraparound planning. The favorite one, or the most important one here, definitely something that our young people say that they are way more committed when they help to make a decision. And I think conversely also when they don't help to make a decision, their reaction very consciously sometimes is, well, I'm not going to go along with that and I'm going to make it as difficult as possible for that to come about. Okay, so moving along to our next slide. Next one, Sarah. Oh, I'm sorry. So this one does show, you'll be able to get these slides. It shows where you can get these things from the Research and Training Center website, and again, they'll be linked from the National Wraparound Initiative as well. So one of the first things we did was look at the research. We're researchers, so one of the questions that people might have was, you know, aren't we doing that already? You know, we have our young people at the meetings. In fact, in the IEP meetings, they are mandated to be there. Well, it turned out that even despite that mandate for the older young people, for the older youth in IEP, that a large proportion of them were in fact not actually there. Additionally, almost a third of those young people didn't have an actual transition plan, even though they were supposed to, and 16% of those people of those who did have a plan hadn't actually attended when the meeting when the plan was created, and a third of those who attended said that they did not participate and just sat there. Most students in a variety of IEP studies have said that they felt no ownership over their plans, and that if you were to take a sample of IEP plans and look at them as researchers have done, you would find that they are really not at all individualized, that they tend to have the same kinds of goals appearing time after time after time. My own research in this area started out when we were looking more generally at wraparound teams, and we found that we had a open-ended question on our post-meeting survey where we asked people just to mention the one thing that they thought was kind of the biggest challenge or that least satisfied about the meeting, and the thing that was most frequently mentioned was participation of youth in the meeting. So professionals were not particularly happy with the level of youth participation, but they also expressed a lot of uncertainty about how to do something better. Our research found that young people rarely participated in what we would call meaningfully, in that they were sometimes asked to volunteer information, but they were not asked about their own goals for their own lives. They were often their participation was sort of in the form of them responding to yes/no questions, and in a lot of cases the young people really were sitting there and not participating at all. And rarely were the young people even there for the whole meeting. And the largest number of meetings, there were no youth present at all, but some of those were quite a bit younger. And even among the older youth, the usual approach was to have them there for part of the meeting, which our youth advisors said was really not something that they appreciated, because it seemed like then after they were left the room, they felt that all the important decisions were going to be made when they left. So we are going to go to our next poll, and just quickly for our own curiosity and maybe to satisfy some of your curiosity too, ask you how satisfied you are currently with the level of youth participation in the wraparound team planning in the program that you have, just to compare that to what professionals were telling us 5 years ago about participation in their programs. So in the meantime, I'm going to be moving on to the next topic, which was sort of, so what's really to be gained? And again, we talked about this from the youth perspective, and that little poll that we did, the first one, does mention some of the things that can be gained. We did a kind of exhaustive research review to find relevant research that would sort of help us to understand the exact mechanisms by which increased youth participation yields benefits to people, including both the team and the youth, him or herself. And there's actually very robust research that speaks to this question, and a lot of it happens in the area of engagement. So just quick, Sarah, you want to show the poll results? So we found that people are somewhat satisfied with the highest response, closely followed by not really satisfied. So it seems like people are kind of in the middle, with a few people extremely satisfied and a few people pretty dissatisfied. So that's that poll. And by the way, the results of the polls will also be available on the website. So if you want to look at these again later for some reason, you will have access to them from the same web page. So what's to be gained? As I was mentioning, there's quite a bit of research that speaks to this issue, and not surprising to anybody, but again, very strong findings from the research is that engagement increases when people feel they have a choice. And it's important to remember that this doesn't mean when they get to make all the choices. It means when they feel they have contributed to making a choice. So when people get to choose things or contribute to choosing things, they are more interested, excited, and confident in as they undertake the activity. And specifically, adolescents have a more positive mood, higher sense of well-being, and they perform better in the activity. The second sort of main area that's to be gained is that learning to make plans and achieve goals is, of course, a crucial experience for this phase of life. And it's in essence, it's really the hallmark of the transition phase, is becoming independent and capable of guiding your own life. People who have this skill, which is called in both globally and specifically in different areas of life. It's called self-determination or self-efficacy. And people who have this capacity basically reap a lot of benefits in life. They are more optimistic and hopeful in life, and they are more likely to persist when things don't go their way and keep trying. They tend to have better mental health, use better coping strategies, and avoid depression. They are more able to adopt and maintain healthy habits and behavior change. And there's various studies that show that youth with disabilities generally who have developed higher levels of self-efficacy and self-determination do better after high school in a whole range of outcomes, including independent living, making money, and completing further education. Next, please. So based on this sort of survey of the literature, we went about trying to create the Achieve My Plan project. And it started more than 5 years ago, and it's essentially a research project, and the goal of the project is to develop and test an intervention that will really increase meaningful youth participation in planning, and then ultimately also that will improve other outcomes to emerge from that planning, including things like, as I just mentioned, self-efficacy, self-determination, but also other outcomes I'm going to talk about in a minute. Longer-term outcomes all the way from engagement and treatments to mental health outcomes. We began, as I mentioned, with our advisory board. We wanted especially to have young people involved in developing this intervention, but we also wanted to involve their parents and other caregivers as well as providers, because we wanted to create something that would be relevant and seen as feasible and attractive by all of those different stakeholders. So our advisory board, especially in the very early years when we were developing this, worked very intensively with us to create materials, advise on our research, and they continue to work with us making presentations. So our basic question was, what would be the characteristics of an intervention with the best chance of its success? And so we thought that it would have to be feasible within the resources of agencies, primarily could be carried out by redirecting existing resources, not require a lot of new resources, that it would be appealing, as I mentioned before, that it would address concerns of providers and caregivers around exactly how to empower young people without kind of creating conflict on the team or making matters worse through conflicting agendas. And that it would also be engaging for young people and immediately something that they would feel was helpful. And then we also wanted it to be increased participation, to have an obvious effect, to increase participation in ways that could be seen and measured and that would contribute to the eagerness of the participants to further participate and to use the skills and approaches that are part of the AMP process. So, next slide. One of the first things that we put together, I thought there was another slide in here, but we have on the website a series of resources. I'm sure that slide will pop up at some point. But we put all this preliminary material together. Here we go. Into a series of publications that you can download on from the Pathways website, and again we'll have a link to that on the NWI website. And these are summaries that we think will be useful to anybody planning something along these lines. So the first publication there is really focusing on the research evidence for why including youth is a good idea. And it's accessible format. It's in the form of a frequently asked questions sort of thing, and it also has a bibliography reference list in the back, so that if you're preparing a grant proposal and you need to cite actual scientific evidence, you can use this as a resource for that as well. Then the second publication talks about the best practices, how do you translate this into practices? I'm sorry, Sarah, can you back up one slide? So this is what we incorporated into Achieve My Plan. So again, this is derived from the research, and once we got ideas that we worked with our advisors, and we practiced them, and we practiced with youth out in the community, and eventually came up with a final Achieve My Plan intervention. And our general framework for supporting participation focuses in these 4 different areas. One, and I'm going to talk about each one in a minute, but basically organizational commitment, that you need to have, that the youth participation support work can't just be done in isolation from other work, that it really needs to be an overall part of the organization's commitment to not just to carrying out that work, but also to kind of taking it to heart when lessons are learned, and helping the organization to evolve as a whole into an organization that promotes youth participation, engagement, empowerment more generally. Then specifically preparing the youth to participate in the Wraparound team meeting or other team meetings, to create a meeting that is going to be conducive to the youth actually participating, so making structures and promoting interactions that will help the youth to feel comfortable in their participation. And then finally accountability, to have the team have some level of accountability to following through on what was decided at the meetings. Once the youth has participated in the meeting and been a part of decisions, then as we mentioned before, it's important that those decisions actually be acted on. So AMP is essentially a structured process for implementing these best practices, and we just heard from Tammy another process where they're getting at a lot of the same things, of helping the youth prepare, think about their own goals, and so on. So again, these best practices, next slide, have been in the second publication, the sort of the one in the middle of those, really summarizes what the research, again, what we gained through the research and our conversations with our advisors and community stakeholders about what really should be a part of a successful intervention to increase youth participation. And I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about what AMP does to fulfill these best practices. So it starts out with the organizational commitment, as I mentioned, and the idea that the organizational culture has to express its support for the values of youth participation. So this means that the organization needs to see it as a priority and something that is feasible for the organization. The organization basically has to be open to learning from what comes up as a result of increasing youth participation. Additionally, it has to be supported in a practical way. There has to be, I'm going to talk about this later when we get into the nuts and bolts about the AMP intervention itself, but there has to be time allocated for people to carry out the intervention and for related tasks by other people. Again, we talked about this primarily as being a reallocation of existing resources. And then there has to be training, supervision, and other support for the roles directly involved with the AMP intervention. And eventually, it's pretty inevitable that increasing youth participation at the team level will cause ideas and sort of motivation to change, to percolate kind of up through the organization as a whole, so that valuing youth participation in decision making and youth empowerment are going to become more, well, if the organization is open to it, what we're saying is that the organization needs to be open to that, because the impetus to change will, as I mentioned, percolate up from the planning process. So kind of the heart of the AMP intervention is work with each young person individually with what we call the AMP coach. And this AMP coach, can be a variety of people, and in our work so far, we've had it be like a sort of a single person or a coach who's dedicated to that coach position, who comes and provides coaching to the youth. And in our case, when we've implemented it locally, our staff has done that. We've used master's level social work interns to work with young people. But it's also been done by an AMP coach hired within an organization, and that was their exclusive role. We've had clinicians do it. is part of their work with the young person. We've also had people in family support role working with young people. We have not actually had a peer or near peer person like the youth coordinators that Tammy was describing earlier do this role, work with young people, but we certainly see it as something that would provide a structured approach for doing some of that same work that Tammy was describing. And the coach works with the young person kind of intensively for about 3 hours prior to the first meeting where AMP is going to be introduced to the team. This doesn't necessarily have to be at the very beginning of the wraparound process, and for our research so far we have actually introduced it at about 3 months. So the coach works over a series of these pre-meetings to prepare the youth for this first AMP meeting. And the things that they specifically do are work with the young person to prepare items and goals. These are along the lines of the same action steps that Tammy was describing earlier, but rather than working with them separately with a direct support provider, the youth will present these to the team to be included on the wraparound plan, and the team will help the young person to carry out the action steps that he or she has identified. Another really important thing that the coach works with the young person is to review the agenda before the team meeting and to understand what other people are going to be talking about in the meeting, because these are big decisions, and I think our research is really bearing this out, that it's very important for the young person to have a chance to think about what he or she wants to say. So, for example, if medications are going to be changed or placements are being discussed, the youth has the opportunity before the meeting to know what the agenda items are and to prepare his or her thoughts about that. We also work with the young person to explore the options for handling uncomfortable topics outside the meeting. So if something comes up that the young person really, really doesn't want to have discussed during the meeting, and the example that our advisors always came back to was a young woman who was kind of forced to talk about her birth control in front of the team. These are things that can be handled outside the meeting, and it makes a young person much more comfortable coming into a meeting to know that they really know what's going to be talked about and that there aren't going to be some of these surprise topics coming up. We also encourage, we'll have the coaches review some very basic communication skills for the meeting, focus on how to contribute productively to the meeting to get your ideas across in a way that will be heard by the other team meetings. Also sort of think through what situations may cause the young person to become upset or anxious or angry, and what to do and how the coach can support the young person to stay calm and focused, and to get other support during the meeting. So we have another poll here for you. Just talk about if you were interested in preparing young people before an AMP meeting or another wraparound team meeting. How feasible do you think that would be for your organization? Again, we're talking about prior to the first team meeting, about 3 hours total of preparation, and that is then there's an ongoing phase which involves further work, but not necessarily with the AMP coach, but does require some communication with whoever's facilitating the team. So we have results of our poll. We got most people thinking that it was very feasible to do this kind of thing, which is very encouraging. And only 3% saying not feasible at all. This would be a time when it would be fascinating to talk to people and find out what kinds of organizations seem to be more compatible with this kind of approach, or what it is about what's going on in the workplaces. Okay, so moving along to during the meeting. So this is another important thing that we work on with AMP, is to make sure that the meeting that the young person prepared for is the meeting that actually happens. And this turns out to be extremely important and not not super difficult if everybody understands some basic parameters, and this is part of the organizational support for AMP. But anyway, no surprises. That is the thing that our youth advisors kept telling us. They did not want to be put on the spot. And really, I can't emphasize enough that I really feel that a huge impact of how AMP works for meetings is that simply by letting the youth be aware of what's going to happen in the meeting and prepared, it really avoids probably at least half of the potential difficult situations that come up in meetings, because even if it's something that they're not necessarily happy about, a kind of decision that they may not be able to control, the opportunity to think about it beforehand helps them to come to grips with what they can and can't influence, and to do some proactive thinking about how to make that whatever it is work for them in the best way. So another thing is we really place a lot of focus on keeping planning proactive, and that means that we're not going to throw out the whole agenda just because something bad happened last week. Be totally reactive and kind of flustered. People tisking to the youth about what they should have done last week and why they were so bad. So we really want to make sure that the agenda, again, the agenda the youth is prepared for, is the agenda that happens. And when items that are not on the agenda come up, we have a process for putting those. I'm sure you've all heard of the parking lot. We're going to deal with those at the end of the meeting, figure out how to deal with them, but we're not going to let them derail the whole meeting. And then the other important things we want to, and we do training with the team facilitators to ensure that everyone is respectful during the meeting, and that the facilitator is in control of the meeting so that it doesn't get derailed. We have ground rules that we work with young people to customize before their team meetings, and in the first AMP meeting they present those ground rules. Typically the young people like to do this themselves, or the facilitator can do it. They present their ground rules to the team and have everybody agree to them. And again, this issue of managing crises that are not on the agenda, it takes a strong facilitator to not get kind of sucked into some of that stuff, and to keep the meeting being proactive and not reactive. Then we have identified, we have a whole training that we do about sort of common ways that meetings can go wrong, and we identify these with our young people, and we have, because our research involves videotaping team meetings, we have videotaped examples of the kind of things that can go wrong. And some of the main things that our young people have identified and that commonly happen, one we call therapizing, and this is not in any way a dig at therapy, but it's kind of a fake sort of therapy where someone on the team wants to elicit a certain kind of specific answer from the youth and keep asking, so why do you think you did that? And keep asking the question until they get the answer that they want, or ask a series of questions that the youth kind of has, in a way, really no option but to arrive at the conclusion that this person is trying to get them to state. And they usually, you can usually tell that it's with great reluctance on the part of the young person. They don't believe the answers they're giving. They just know they're supposed to be giving those answers. Badgering, again, this is something where people just kind of reminding the youth kind of over and over again what they should be doing and how what they were doing was wrong. Another thing is just when certain team members start to take off with the meeting and kind of rambling on, and how to kind of get control of that. We train the facilitators on how to get control of that, and how to recognize when it's no longer productive. Another thing that happens in AMP meetings sometimes is that young people put their items on the agenda and the other team members want to help too much, when we're trying to promote the young person taking in the primary goal in working on their own agenda items. And then just keeping the meeting efficient and moving ahead, because most young people will not have patience for a meeting that goes more than about an hour or a little over. So how to get the work done quickly so that that can be the case. Okay, so then finally after the meeting, as we mentioned before, next slide, we're talking about some accountability. So in AMP, we have kind of two kinds of accountability. One is accountability to the plan that's created during the meeting. So the decisions that are made in the meeting need to be recorded so that later on we can follow up on who did what. And the youth has a record of those commitments and action steps and has access to a copy of the plan. Additionally, we want people to be accountable to having actually done the AMP process. So we have a fidelity measurement. Did the youth get the kind of preparation that we expect with AMP, and were the meeting structures and procedures that are part of AMP, were those actually followed by the team? We also look at satisfaction measures and some outcome measures. So with AMP, next slide, as I mentioned, we have worked with sites to provide support for implementing the AMP intervention. So what that includes when we go into work with a site is training and coaching for the people who are going to be the AMP coaches. And as I mentioned before, those people could actually be in a variety of different formal roles in your program or outside the program, as I mentioned, working with the interns, the MSW interns. And we are able, because of the videotape that we take from team meetings, to provide that coaching using video excerpts from sort of showing examples of optimal and not so optimal work AMP coaches working with young people. And we have a capacity through our research center to do that video-based training either directly or remotely. So we also have done trainings where we do the initial training, then we have our AMP coaches on site at some distance from our university, and they tape their work with young people and upload it to our video site, and then they can receive supervision from an AMP supervisor here to help them improve their practice with young people. We also do training and coaching, as I mentioned, for team facilitators so that they can control the meeting well and create meetings that are conducive to youth participation. We provide organizational training which describes how the organization needs to support AMP and the structures and procedures that kind of go along with it. We also provide a variety of different informational and social marketing materials for staff, youth, and families so that everybody understands what AMP is and kind of what has an expectation, kind of realistic expectation about what's going to happen when AMP is implemented. And then we also do data analysis and evaluation. In particular, when we are involved in a formal research project, this is a very important component of what we do. So I'm going to try, usually in webinar we try to avoid these kind of animations, but I'm going to try it anyway. So this is basically a summary of our logic model or program theory for why we think AMP works. So we put together the organizational support, the training and coaching that we offer. We hope that staff will implement these best practices related to AMP in the areas that I discussed before. So this leads to a high quality, high fidelity AMP process, and again we are concerned with assessing this, especially again for the research project. We want to know, did we actually implement AMP as we said we did. So we have fidelity tools, we use observational measures, as I mentioned, we videotape both the AMP coaching process and team meetings. We have a very unobtrusive and we think successful way for doing that. We also use a series of assessments. Oops, back up one. We review plans. Again, this is something we just do for our research project, and we also assess satisfaction. So when we do this process, okay, next one, what are we really expecting to achieve? Well, first of all, we expect that youth will be part of a proactive, productive planning process. And the research shows that people who experience success in planning and positive coping are the people who develop self-efficacy. So we're really looking at trying to drive their experience of learning how to make goals that are important for them in their lives and how to take steps to achieve those goals, enlisting the support of the wraparound team as they go. Next. So we're also anticipating that services and supports will work better because of the sort of people who choose or feel they have a role in making decisions are more committed. So we're anticipating that as a result of participation in AMP through the team meeting, that alliance with the team and the providers will increase, and that engagement, commitment, and retention in services will also be increased. And these are things, again, that we are, in our research project, we're measuring. In your own site, you probably wouldn't want to measure in all of this detail. Additionally, we anticipate that youth will make progress on their goals, the self-identified goals, and that all of this in turn will, in a kind of self-reinforcing way, contribute to positive outcomes. And those will include, as Tammy mentioned, the development of assets, of which, foremost among which we think is that self-determination, self-efficacy, that they'll also develop a sense of empowerment, that through their engagement in services and through their own activities, they will increase in various areas of functioning, and that they will achieve the goals, both their own goals from the wraparound process and the goals of the team in general. Next. So boy, that didn't turn out real well. There's sort of a missing piece of the pie there, but all the rest is one piece. And this is satisfaction data. Well, that really doesn't look right. So this is satisfaction data. It doesn't have a very good, sort of got strangely reproduced here. But essentially, this is from our post-AMP meetings. And what this would show you is that the very large, well, that's just really messed up. Approximately 2/3 of people coming out of AMP meetings, and this includes all stakeholders, this is true both of young people and their parents and professionals, thought the AMP meeting was much better than a usual meeting. I don't just ignore what's up there. About 1/3 of them thought it was somewhat better than usual, and we had a small segment of people who thought it was worse than usual. When we did further analyses with this data, what we were able to show, and we have some publications based on this data that are coming out soon, that increasing the youth participation did not cause either service providers who are on AMP teams or wraparound teams with AMP, or parents to feel that their perspectives were receiving less attention. So in other words, we were able to create what we describe as kind of a win-win situation where the youth was participating more, but it didn't mean that other people felt that they were participating less. Okay, next please. And these are just some of the findings from our assessments that we used. We found that empowerment, the YES is an empowerment measure with 3 subscales. You can see the total empowerment went up, as did the subscales per self, which means a person's confidence in their ability to manage their own mental health condition, and the services subscale, which is their confidence in their ability to work with providers, basically to optimize their services and supports. And then the participation, we found significant increases in the total scale, as well as the subscales related to preparation and accountability. And these were with a fairly small sample, so these are very strong findings to find something significant in a small sample. Next, please. And this is some of the findings from the video data that sort of was an objective way of looking at various aspects of the young person's participation in the actual AMP team meeting. So we found that the instances of youth speaking the entire time went from about 2.5% to about 12.5%, which is a huge increase. And those are the times when, that's a dramatic change. We also found the percentage of times when youth speaking significantly. Now this means they're not speaking the whole time but still speaking pretty much, and that means more than just saying yes or no or not speaking at all. Went from a little under 30% to over 40%. So if you add those together, you're looking at at over half of the percentage of times where youth actively participating. So what we are looking at I should have backed up. I should have said this. So we're looking at 20-second segments of the meeting. So in this case, in more than half of the 20-second segments in the meeting, which basically translates to, essentially more than half of the meeting, the youth are really actively participating and speaking, where before that had been much lower. We also found that sort of the positive and strength-based character of the team was significantly higher. The positive comments made by the young person, sort of strength-based comments made by the young person were higher, and that the team was actually, where previously this had been almost never happened, that teams were actually agreeing with ideas presented by the young person and making them part of the plan. Okay, next please. So again, we'll give you this website, but here's the address for the AMP page on the Pathways website, and again we'll post links to this information as well as some of the information directly on the NWI website. Next. Okay, so here are some numbers, contact information specifically about Achieve My Plan if you're interested in further information, and I think we will try to get to some of the questions now. So let's see. Here's one. Is AMP considered an evidence-based practice model? Well, it is not at this point been, for example, registered in the NRAP or any other databases of effective programs. We are what we call it empirically based, in that we now have some evidence for its effectiveness, but to get to the point where it's formally recognized as an evidence-based practice requires several research studies, multiple research investigators, and so on, so the standard is somewhat higher. So we are working towards that. At this point, we are in a sort of just getting a foot in the door in terms of having the evidence that would be necessary for that. Is the AMP training available through membership? No, this is something that we can discuss with people. Again, if you use a contact information, we have various levels of the training and implementation support, so it's all something that would have to be worked out through our project at the Pathways Research and Training Center. Let's see. You mentioned that MSW interns. Would MFT, I'm not sure what that is, be eligible for training as well? From our perspective, almost, as I mentioned before, almost anybody could be trained to do the AMP process, and because we have this ability to do this very kind of hands-on coaching where we videotape the coaches working with young people, by the time we finish working with a coach and we actually have a certification that we offer, we feel very confident that that person is prepared to work successfully with the AMP intervention. And I think from our perspective, there are maybe some people who don't seem to be cut out for it, but it's really less a function of their academic or other preparation than it is a certain kind of I don't know, basic orientation towards working with young people that you can find kind of in all walks of life. Here's a very interesting question. So how do you work out conflicting agendas between youth and their caregiver, and when the parents have the family culture where they do not want youth voice at their meetings? Well, let me just talk about the first part of the question first, which is a little bit easier. We work out conflicting agendas by a very intentional part of the AMP process. As I mentioned before, the coach works with the young person about developing. It starts with the process of sort of envisioning where they want to be a few years out into the future, and what they might have as their kind of dream goal. But in the AMP meeting, we don't actually focus on that long-term goal, because sometimes those are very controversial. I mean, we've had young people who have said they wanted to, there's a young woman who wanted to be a stripper, or a young man who, he wanted to travel to Japan, and we knew that his family was not supportive of that. But the long-term goals are not really so important within the AMP process because we ask the young people to step back and kind of narrow it down and focus to some immediate activities that are connected to those goals. So, and those turn out to be much less controversial. And one of the kind of pieces of the protocol we go through when we're asking young people about developing these very short-term action steps is that they have to be something that they think the team can support and their parent can support, and they actually have homework between two of the AMP preparation sessions to share this with their caregivers or parents, and this the coach offers support, so the coach is willing to be on the phone for that. So we have not found, I mean, when we talk about these activities, they'll often be things like, you know, gathering some information, making a visit to a community college or an art school, or getting a library card, or investigating a career, or visiting a veterinary practice, or something like that. So usually these are things that don't cause a lot of controversy on the team. And so when those are accomplished, then the subsequent team meetings come back, and the young person put some more action items onto the agenda. Family culture where youth do not want youth voice at their meetings. Again, I think that the best approach that we have here is always to try to communicate with the parents about what's going on in AMP, and to have both the young person take the initiative doing some of that, but have the AMP coach and, if necessary, the team facilitator there to be part of that. I think that once the once the activities are clear, we really haven't had families that have objected to including these on the team. I just can't, I'm sure that maybe some of this kind of thing will come up in the future, but we really have not experienced that so far in our implementation of AMP. So I have another question. Tammy, are you still on the line? Can you answer a question now? Hello? Well, maybe Tammy muted herself. Tammy, let me know if you get back on again. It looks like we might have. Oh.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So we have a question here. What is the average age of your youth coordinators?
Of the youth coordinators?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, we've had a wide range, anywhere from 19 to 27.
Mm-hmm. What's most typical?
20s, early 20s.
Mm-hmm. And if a young person were to stay in that role for a long time, would there be a point at which you'd say, well, now you're too old and you need to move on or get another job?
That's a really good question. We actually get that a lot. I think it's mainly because of the name youth coordinator, but we're really not looking at the age of the individual as much as we're looking at their experiences as a youth. And so, you know, it's really the individual feeling that they're able to do the job. And we have older youth coordinators who are 27, closer to their 30s, and they, you know, do great at their job. And it's really how they use their personal experiences to provide their job.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I have another question here. I think this is about AMP. Do you think the model will work as well in the child welfare arena? And yes, I do. We have a similar kind of project here in the Pathways Center that exclusively works with young people who are transitioning from child welfare. And additionally, we have done AMP with kids who are involved with child welfare. And I actually think the approach would need to be changed only very little, even if it were exclusively focused on child welfare. And that's an arena where certainly young people who have been that intensively involved in services, you know, a lot of times have just not had a lot of opportunity to exercise or develop that self-determination or self-efficacy. So it's really important for these young people who are going to be emancipated to learn skills for decision-making, setting goals, and moving towards them. So I have a question here. I think, again, this one would be for you, Tammy. What are the types of staff trainings that you offered? I think you mentioned some of these. It has the examples here, conflict resolution. I think you mentioned some of those. Were there others that you had in mind?
Really, we have some that we set ahead of time, like conflict resolution or self-care and things like that. But a lot of times, through our supervision, we talk to the youth coordinators about what types of trainings they're feeling that they need, or through supervision, we hear about kind of areas that it would be helpful to look into trainings for that individual. So it's a combination. It's a combination of having those mandatory trainings that we already have set in place, some of them being mandated by the county that we're in and the workplace that we're in, and then others that we feel would be relevant to anybody being hired in this role, like trainings around supporting them telling their story and things like that. So I think training is something that definitely should be ongoing for this type of role, because the system, even just within laws and things like that, is constantly changing. So making sure that staff are on the same page with what's going on with the system, to making sure they have the tools needed for self-care.
Okay, so I have another question that came in here. Are there youth characteristics that are more conducive to AMP? I think I'll answer that by saying that we have worked, what we've been more surprised with is the broad spectrum of young people that we've worked with very successfully. You know, we set out our target as 14 and older, but because of interest from the programs that we were working in, we've worked with youth as young as 12 that I know of, or 11, and in some cases dramatically, and that also with young people with, I would say, pretty significant cognitive challenges as well. So we, you know, we tried to design it in a way that would be, you know, pretty accessible, and the process, you know, pretty well defined. So other than that, I'm not sure. I mean, we have had both very talkative and very shy people involved. We've worked with the young people, of course, a number of them with, you know, difficulty with attentional issues and so on. So actually, we have reached the end of our time. I'm going to call on one person. If you happen to be out there, we have one question from a person who wants to do their question verbally. Lois Law, if you're out there, I have unmuted your phone, so if you have a question, you want to go ahead and ask it. Well, perhaps that person is not on the webinar anymore. Okay, well, on behalf of the National Wraparound Initiative, I'd like to particularly thank Tammy and her organization for supporting her participation in this webinar, and I would like to thank all of our attendees for being a part of this experience, and remind you again to look for our email with the follow-up information where you can access the slides. Feel free to visit the NWI website. The web address is up there on the monitor, and thanks to everybody who's chatting their supportive comments to us right now. We'll be back in a couple weeks. I'll tell you the next couple webinars. You can register for these. We have one Tuesday, March 29th on integrating wraparound into schools, and on Wednesday, April 13th, strengthening wraparound practice through directive supervision. Okay, well, thanks again, everyone, and have a great day. Bye-bye.